We're going to start the second panel. I just want to introduce the moderator. I could speak at great length about him, but I won't. It is Steve Coll. Steve is a frequent visitor at the center and a good friend. You probably know him if you're in this business of national security for his book, Ghost Wars. He is now just about to embark, or probably is more embarked than he's letting us know, on the second volume of Ghost Wars. He is currently the president of the New America Foundation, another friend and associate of the Center on National Security here at Fordham. He has written innumerable books. He has won innumerable prizes, 2 of them being Pulitzer. In addition to all of that, he is just a wonderful human being who contributes daily to the conversation about national security and the United States. So, Steve.
Thank you, Karen. That was very sweet. And good morning, everybody. We're going to try to broaden the conversation a little bit beyond law, I think, in this panel. And we have, nonetheless, a bunch of lawyers to do that. And we'll try to take into account some of the ethical foreign policy and political questions that shape targeted killing as it is practiced by the United States today. In introducing this discussion, I thought I'd very briefly reflect on Mr. Johnson's speech, which was thoughtful and also quite careful. And this sense that seems to be gathering over the last 3 to 6 months that we're in a kind of perestroika era about drone attacks, by which I refer to the dynamic that develops when a government promises transparency, but the public recognizes that the values it's promoting are not actually operational. And so you get this snowball that starts to roll when you grow for the adequate amount of transparency. More and more questions follow the promise. And it's not really clear what the end state of this will be, presumably not the collapse of the drone regime, but there's a dynamism at work that's interesting and different than what I can recall in the last couple or 3 years. I think the pace of drone attacks is one factor. The death of a U.S. citizen in a targeted killing is another factor. The death of Osama bin Laden, the obvious fragmentation of al-Qaeda, and the question of the relevancy of the AUMF framework is another factor. And so you get ideas like the National Security Court that you wouldn't have heard just 9 months ago. So it's an interesting moment, and I hope that our conversation will illuminate it a little bit. And we're just going to go down the table, first with Hina, and then Gabor and David, and then here's Zubair, Shah. You have their thumbnails, but Hina, of course, is the director of the ACLU's very important, influential national security project, and so I'll ask her to start us off.
Thanks very much, Steve. I thought I'd throw out there, and start off by throwing out there 2 assertions that I will discuss very quickly in 5 minutes that have been allocated. One is that I don't think that we can call this targeted killing program targeted in any meaningful sense anymore to the extent that we ever could. And let me back up a little bit here. In 2009-2010, I had the privilege of working with the UN's then Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, Professor Philip Alston, on his report on targeted killing for the United Nations. And as we were working on his report, we really were grappling with the idea of targeted killing and what to call this phenomenon. And we decided to stay with the term because it was one that had become part of the lexicon, and because we could define it as an exceptional, what had been exceptional now becoming a policy on the part of certain states, primarily the United States, Israel to some extent, Russia to another extent, of selecting people and using lethal force against them as a premeditated, deliberate manner. And one of the things that we were struggling with is that sometimes this use of lethal force is lawful. And although that will be the subject of the next panel, I think I want to just address it very quickly here, that sometimes when you are in the context of, for example, human rights, and the government is faced with a specific, concrete, and imminent threat, then the use of lethal force is lawful. And sometimes those kinds of targeted killings are lawful. In the context of an armed conflict, if a civilian is directly participating in hostilities, then the use of lethal force is lawful against that civilian. But what we wanted to capture was this growing policy that, that captured both lawful targeted killings and unlawful outside the context of armed conflict and potentially outside the strict confines of imminence. We've now gone far beyond what we were looking at in 2009. According to Senator Lindsey Graham, there are approximately 4,700 people that have been killed as part of the United States targeted killing program, and the evidence grows that the vast majority of these people are not top-level Al-Qaeda or Taliban leaders, that they are, in fact, potentially low-level insurgents who have a beef with the countries in which they are located and do not actually pose a specific threat to the United States, whether in or outside of armed conflict. The use of signature strikes, as is now known, is against people whose identity we don't know, but who are targeted on apparent patterns of behavior. And so we've grown further and further away from what the white paper, which Mr. Johnson talked about, really sought to do, which was identify the standards under which you can target even a particular category of person, a US citizen. And there, you also saw how the legal standards have changed, where what might be imminence no longer means imminence, because you no longer need a, under the white paper's terms, actual evidence, clear evidence, that a specific plot is about to occur. So further and further away from anything that might be called targeted in any meaningful sense, and further and further away from the kinds of limitations that are imposed in order to ensure that both in and outside of armed conflict, the taking of life is exceptional. The second point that I wanted to make to you, and this is related to Steve's perestroika point, the perestroika moment that we are in, which is that from a human rights, civil liberties perspective, the legitimacy of any action has to be judged by the transparency and accountability that the government provides when engaged in that action. And I think under both of those hallmarks, the government's targeted killing policy has been an abysmal failure. And it has served without meaningful transparency about who we are actually killing, where, why, and under what specific criteria. The government undermines its own legitimacy for the program that it might seek to assert. And it prevents public, legal, and even political accountability for these kinds of decisions that are deeply controversial. The courts, as Mr. Johnson mentioned during his speech, are starting to push back into cases brought by the ACLU. First taking place on Friday, in which the court said that clearly it's no longer logical or plausible to deny that the CIA has an interest in targeted killings. The second, the Alice in Wonderland case, in which Judge McMahon of the Southern District of New York said that she had a very hard time concluding, but ultimately concluded, that the government's ill-defined but vast and seemingly ever-growing exercise could still be kept secret, is on appeal. Now, this second case is one in which the government is taking the position that it cannot confirm or deny that it has even killed 3 US citizens. Anwar al-Awlaki, which according to the front page of the New York Times, a specific memo was written to justify his death, Samir Khan, and 16-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who was killed in a drone strike in Yemen 2 weeks after his father was killed. With respect both to transparency and accountability, Obviously, our democratic society depends on a level of transparency from our government in order to enforce our values and norms. And I think we're going to see more transparency grow. I think the pressure on the administration to provide information is growing inexorable. But what kind of transparency should we look for? First of all, I think we should go beyond the focus, obviously, of 4 US citizens and look to the thousands of non-citizens who have been killed and seek the legal criteria, not just for the killing of citizens, but also for the killings of non-citizens. So of the 11 Office of Legal Counsel memoranda that are reported to exist, perhaps 4 or 5 relate to citizens, and we should be asking to see all of them. We should also know more about the process under which targeted killings are carried out. Part of what human rights democracy requires is to know who should be held accountable, politically, if not anything else, when the state carries out action of this enormous nature. Right now, we don't know whether it is the president, whether it is the senior high-level official referred to in the white paper, or someone else. And what process is used to ensure that the killing decisions made are lawful and legitimate. Relatedly, we should know who the CIA, I can say it even though others may not be able to say it, who the CIA and the Department of Defense have the authority to kill. That's the legal criteria, but also who they have killed. To the extent that names are known, we should know who's been killed. There is no legitimate interest, or I should ask, what legitimate interest would be served by hiding the identity of who has been killed? We should also know who the administration defines as a so-called militant and as a so-called civilian, and what the difference is between those two, and what the numbers of the dead have been on both counts. And finally, we should know who the US counts as an associated force and on what grounds under the AUMF. Mr. Johnson spoke earlier today about how the targeted killing, how lethal force authority is being used under a combination of the authorization for use of military force and self-defense authority. At a basic level, we should know who associated forces are because they have as yet been undefined. To the extent definitions have been offered, they've been inadequate. One final point here is that it's not just us, the American public, for whom transparency and accountability is important. There is now growing international pressure that in many ways parallels the pressure that we saw growing against the use of secret detention in Guantanamo by the Bush administration, growing international pressure for the United States to provide greater transparency, and also growing international pressure amongst our allies to take public positions on the United States' claim of lethal authority. I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago because I'd been asked to give a briefing to members of the European Parliament about the targeted killing program. And they then issued a statement that said and called upon other European countries to take public positions because of the concern that many in Europe now have that if public positions are not taken by America's friends and allies, then their silence will be seen as acquiescence and, if not worse, consent to a legal framework with which they do not agree. So let me stop there and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. And so now we'll hear from Gabor, who's the International Legal Director of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Steve. So if Winston Churchill was right that America always does the right thing after exhausting all of the alternatives, then it seems fairly obvious that as concerns counterterrorism policy in general, we're at the moment quite deeply buried in and committed to alternatives. And the debate on drones, I think, is an excellent example because the debate that we've been listening to so far in the world writ large is an example of how we're missing the mark. And I want to give a couple of examples of that. Exhibit 1 I would call drones, drones, drones. So yes, they do present some unique challenges to traditional concepts of the law and use of force, the laws of armed conflict, and human rights law, and I'll touch on them shortly. But drones are not the message, they're the messenger. Like a submarine or like an airplane that launches a missile, like a helicopter that has a gunship, and like boots on the ground that conduct targeted killings. Exhibit 2, drone attacks on American citizens. Americans, it turns out, are a minuscule percentage of the people killed by drones. People killed by drones are a minuscule percentage of those affected by drones, and people killed and otherwise affected by drones are just a small minority of those killed and otherwise affected by targeted killing more generally. Exhibit 3, drone strikes on U.S. soil. My reaction to that is maybe a useful conversation to get things rolling, but essentially, give me a break. Droning Americans and droning a Starbucks in Des Moines, Iowa might capture the American imagination, but I think there's a real risk that focusing on these non-issues will merely serve to throw the rest of the world under the bus and in turn bite us in the backside. Exhibit 4, the categorical rejection by some of the concept of targeted killing. Now, here's a reality check. In the real world, and especially in the real world of war, the alternative to targeted killing isn't no killing, it's indiscriminate killing, which is a war crime. So what I'm saying here is we shouldn't shy away, and this is a way in which I might differ somewhat from what Hina's remarks were. I wouldn't shy away from using the term targeted killing. I would shy away from the use of the term improperly and indiscriminately. We have as a nation hardly begun to address the issues presented by targeted killings, such as, well, what does and doesn't constitute war? What are the temporal and geographic limitations of war? If the context is war, who can be targeted? If it's not war, who can be targeted? What are the terms war, imminence of harm, member of the enemy, associated forces actually mean? Is there any targeting significance to terms like terrorist, like militant, like insurgent? And these are the terms that we generally read in newspapers that either intentionally or by happenstance may cause a lot of us to think, oh, well, if they say he was a terrorist, then what's the problem? If they say he was an insurgent, what's the problem? These terms, however, have no real legal significance in connection with actual international law applicable to the right to use force. Now, since this is a panel on policy, not law, I'm not going to offer an answer or definitions to all these things now. But I will point out that as a matter of policy, it's a good idea to know the law. And it's a good idea to follow the law. And much of the debate that I have heard about, well, weighing the law against other considerations leaves me kind of flabbergasted. Because law is not a value to be placed on the scale and weighed against other values. It is the scale itself upon which all values are to be placed. And I think that is an important policy understanding. And the most obvious reason why I think law matters is that we, the U.S., are not the only kids on the playground here. The question often gets asked, well, how soon will other states be able to use weaponized remote targeting capacity? The answer is about 5 years ago. And when will non-state armed groups be able to do so? Well, you know, whenever their bake sales or their drug sales enable them to do so. And the fact is that, you know, that they already have that capacity. CIA Director Brennan says that the U.S. is, quote, establishing precedents that other nations may follow, and not all of them will be nations that share our interests or the premium we put on protecting human life, including innocent civilians. Now, as for the self-laudatory vision of American forbearance, again, I'd say, let's get real. While Brennan has steadfastly denied that we make mistakes or countenance collateral damage, the overwhelming body of evidence is that there are a large number of civilian casualties as a result of these strikes, and they fall into two categories. The obvious one is unintended collateral damage. The less obvious one is persons that are intentionally but wrongfully targeted due either to bad intelligence or overbroad application of legal authority. For example, the ideas of targeting propagandists and financiers or military-aged males in a strike zone, rescuers, etc. But you don't have to agree with Brennan to agree with him about the precedent aspect. The precedent we establish is important for a number of reasons. One, obviously, it could be used against us. Two, like the precedent that we established for using torture and rewarding its purveyors with impunity, we undermine our own credibility as a standard bearer for human rights when we preach standards that we do not ourselves follow. Case in point, having told Israel that targeted killings are a bad idea. And most immediately, I think, when we overreach legally, we also tend to overshoot as a matter of policy. In Europe, where there's a long history of terrorism, and where terrorism is treated more like crime than war, it is generally understood that the phenomenon can be controlled but not eliminated. Here in the US, we have more of a culture of fear, I think, more of a culture of zero tolerance, and it makes us think we can eliminate the problem entirely, and we punish our political leaders for their failure to toe that line. To channel Barry Goldwater, extremism in the fight against terrorism is seen not only to be no vice, but indeed a political necessity. And as a consequence, we literally overkill. Whether we thus create more enemies than we're eliminating can't be proved, but it's clear that the fear of the political penalty for letting just one terrorist fall through the enforcement web as a result of a narrow killing policy is greater than the fear of creating more terrorists through broad killing policy. The talk about junking the old AUMF in favor of a new one that expands the scope of targetability to people who may have had nothing to do with 9/11 and in places from Afghanistan is a bad idea, but it's a bad idea that's made easy to swallow by the prospect of drones as a magic bullet. It's easy on the pocketbook, it's easy on American casualty counts, but the question, how can we enrich the targeting environment, is exactly the wrong question. Shifting the burden of death to others because we have a drone is a classic example of tails wagging dogs, or every problem being a nail because all you've got is a hammer. The proper question is, at what point do the threats become so attenuated as to require a response other than extrajudicial killing? As Hina noted, you can't reconcile Lindsey Graham's statement of 4,700 dead with the claim of the United States that we only target al-Qaeda operational leaders. So we seem to have surpassed the reasonable limits of killing, and it seems partly the only reason is because we can. And another reason that we've done so, but one I've long hesitated to admit, but I think the evidence has become strong, that killing and detention are to some extent a zero-sum game. Congress pretends to be tough on terrorism by creating obstacles to detention in the U.S. and to prosecution in the U.S., while the administration pretends to oppose and bemoan those limitations, but invests little political capital in actually fighting them. So I think we're a long way from getting it right. In fact, we're merely at the stage of asking the administration to please tell us its idea of who it can kill in our name. But I think that's exactly what we need to push for, to start down the road of getting it right.
Thank you. And now David Coll from Georgetown University Law School, one of our leading public intellectuals about all these subjects.
Thanks. I thought I would begin with a piece of data that comes from the New Yorker, and it was published under the headline, Coll, Majority of Americans opposed to being killed by drones. And they reported on a poll at the University of Minnesota data that showed that 97% of those surveyed strongly agreed with the following statement: I personally do not want to be killed by a drone. 3% responded, don't know, no opinion. And in response to this poll, Jay Carney, White House spokesperson, said, look, people are afraid of getting killed by a drone. You get that. But there is still broad public support for drone killing somebody else. And I think that, and that's Andy Borowitz, noted pollster for the New Yorker. But I think it's useful in trying to get a handle on the drone problem to put ourselves, to not ask, how do we feel about the one American who was targeted and killed, or even the 4 who have been killed, but to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and to think about how we would respond, for example, if we were in the situation that Pakistan is in. So imagine that China was regularly using drones to kill suspected terrorists in the United States. Imagine that our government said publicly and repeatedly, we do not consent, we do not support this policy. China responded by saying, well, actually they did agree. The United States did give us consent in secret. China furthermore said we have the right to kill suspected terrorists using secret rules. We have the right to do it without acknowledging the identities of the people that we have killed. We don't have to tell you the procedures that we are employing. Furthermore, they told us that they had redefined imminence so that anybody who is a high-level person in a group that is against China and has used terrorism in the past, that by definition poses an imminent threat. Further, imagine that those strikes had killed thousands. Many of them might fall within the category of suspected terrorists, but some percentage, say somewhere between 5 and 25% of those killed were innocent civilians. And of course, even those who are, we say, are not innocent are innocent until proven guilty. Imagine what our response would be to our government if it permitted that to go on. And if it became clear that our government had secretly agreed to allow that to go on. I think the president would be impeached. We would have a different administration. So I think that gives you some sense for the resistance around the world to this strategy. And I think that resistance, my sense is that resistance is almost as strong as the resistance to the prior administration's use of torture. And that's kind of remarkable because torture is always and absolutely forbidden, including in wartime, but killing is perfectly permissible during wartime. So why such resistance to this use of killing? And I think there's really 6 reasons why such resistance, and they lead to policy prescriptions going forward. The first is the secrecy that surrounds it, the notion that we assert the right to kill without setting forth the ground rules and without acknowledging that we have killed. The second is that this is a prime example, certainly seen as a prime example, of American exceptionalism and imperialism. Because we would not accept other countries doing what we are doing under the ground rules that we are now pursuing. And we feel the ability to do what we would not accept others doing because we have the power to assert our force in an effectively imperial way around the world. The third reason that people, I think, resist is the substantive definitions, as much as we can glean them, that guide this policy. And in particular, this redefinition of imminence that I referred to earlier, which I think takes targeted killing and the use of lethal force from a last resort, which I think most people would agree is permissible as a last resort in response to an attack on the United States, and turns it into something other than a last resort. I mean, it's not a coincidence that President Bush captured thousands of terrorists and killed a handful with targeted killings and drones, whereas President Obama has captured almost none and killed thousands. That we've shifted the trigger, and it's through this really problematic substantive redefinition of imminence, I think. Fourth, the procedure is opaque. We don't even know the standard of proof that is employed. Fifth, the scope of war. Terrorism, in some instances, might rise to the level of an armed attack that gives rise to the right of self-defense. I think 9/11 was of that level. But not every terrorist attack is, and it seems that our government has suggested that every terrorist attack might well be so conceived. And those who have proposed a new AUMF, which would authorize, Congress would delegate to the president the power to just put groups on a list that we could then use lethal force against, is deeply problematic in terms of preferencing war as opposed to law enforcement as a response to this problem. And of course, it should be exactly the other way around. And then sixth, and maybe most importantly, drones make it too easy to kill. They take away the disincentives to resorting to lethal force. And so it's not, again, not surprising that we see the numbers. The disincentives, like, in order to kill someone in the past in another country who we wanted to kill, we had to put Americans on the ground in that country. Or we had to fly over with bombs that were very hard to deny. You know, there's some notion of plausible deniability of a surgically targeted killing, but you can't deny a bomb. And the country's not going to consent to dropping a bomb on it. And then third, the fact that drones are in fact relatively precise, surgically precise, makes them easier to go to because they don't have the risk of killing civilians. In some sense, that's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing because it makes it reduces the disincentives to using lethal force. I think when you consider those 6 factors together, you begin to understand why there is so much resistance around the world to what we are doing. How do we respond to that problem, which is a serious problem? It seems to me the first thing we have to do, and I think everybody agrees on this, except for the government, and that is be transparent about the rules that govern what we are doing, and much more transparent than we've been thus far. I think it's a little bit like, you know, trying to figure out what the drone policy these days is a little bit like during the Soviet era, you know, trying to guess what Soviet policy was by virtue of where some person was seated in a picture of the Politburo. We're pulling, you know, a piece out of this speech and a piece out of that speech, and then a leaked white paper, and then and then Jay Johnson says, actually, what was in the white paper isn't accurate. And we should know when the president has the power to take a human life without a trial, without charges, without an opportunity to present a defense of an American or a non-American. We should know what the rules are, and the world should know what those rules are. Second, the use of force has to be limited to truly imminent threats. Not define away imminence, but truly imminent threats, because otherwise it's not a last resort. If the threat is not immediate, it may be that it's not feasible to capture him today, but it might be feasible to capture him tomorrow. If there's not an immediate threat, we shouldn't be using lethal force. Third, we have to come to agreement about the threshold of threat that is required before it's permissible to use lethal force as a response. And this notion, this very dangerous notion, I think is furthered by the AUMF proposal that has been blogged about, and that you hear, is this shift, this notion that equates a terrorist threat to war. A terrorist threat is not always equivalent to war, and doesn't always justify the use of a military response. And too often these days we have equated those two. We need to disaggregate them. And then fourth, we need procedural safeguards. I think there's much to be said for a drone court. I'm less skeptical than Jay Johnson for reasons that I'm happy to go into in the discussion. But whatever the procedural safeguards are, they have to be clear, they have to be robust. Thus far, they seem to be neither. I mean, what we know about it is that they have a conference call every Tuesday to discuss who's on the kill list, and there's 100 people on the conference call. Now, you know, I don't know how many of you have been on a conference call with 100 people, but whatever due process is, that's not it. Finally, why is this so critical? Why is it so critical that we sort of right the ship here? And I think for four reasons. First, because what we do is a precedent for other nations. These drones will be employed by others. We wouldn't want others doing it the way we're doing it. Second, because we are creating terrorists by the way that we are doing it now. In Yemen, we've killed lots of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula folks, but Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula during that same time period has grown, has by some accounts tripled in size, and many of the recruits say that they're coming into it because of their outrage at the drone killings. Third, because we need checks and balances on this kind of authority. And fourth, and most importantly, as a moral and ethical matter, the power to kill must be constrained by law, and that law must be public, and that law must limit that power to kill to a last, not a first resort. Thank you.
Great. And finally, from Peer Zubair Shah, from the Council on Foreign Relations, President.
I will just talk about the situation in Pakistan and why the drone was started in the first place back in 2004. So the Americans, they were not at war with Pakistan, so they had no alternative to take care of the terrorists who were residing in the tribal areas. So there were two options. Either the Americans would go with their boots on the ground, or they would train the Pakistani security forces to capture and kill the Haqqanis and the Al-Qaeda commanders living there. Both these options, the boots on the ground, it was politically sensitive. Musharraf rejected it. The second option, to train the FC and other Pakistani security forces, it would take a lot of time, which was not feasible. So the option which Musharraf government and the Americans agreed was a list of 20 Al-Qaeda commanders that they have to be taken out through drones. And then I'm now talking about 2004. In 2003, Americans had already went to Iraq and the focus had been taken away from Afghanistan. So the war was virtually left to Pakistan and to the drones in the tribal areas. So this was going on when Obama came. The focus came back to Afghanistan and there was a review. And then by that time, the relation between Pakistan and the US, they had what I would call, they had reached that logical point because the interests were so divergent. As far as Afghanistan was concerned, there the drones have been effective, and the Pakistanis' view was that Americans are running a parallel network of informers, and they had this paranoia that if they are being so effective in taking out Al-Qaeda and other commanders, they might get our nuclear weapons tomorrow, and they might get, and they were proved right at the end, and which we saw in the case of Osama bin Laden, that he is riding in close to a military academy, while the CIA is running a safe house just opposite to where Osama bin Laden was living. So all these things, I mean, we have to see in the context why the drones were taking place in the first place and why they increased during the Obama administration. So here, we always talk that there is discussion, the drone issue is in the news, but I don't think we have ever had a serious and genuine discussion. Because there are three reasons. One reason is the very classified nature of the drone program. The Americans, as it's run by CIA, so they would never acknowledge it. Secondly, the very secret nature of the relationship between Pakistan and the US. No one knows whether Pakistan, how much Pakistan has agreed. We know that Pakistan says that it's against our sovereignty, but at the same time, we know that they have provided the Americans with an air base, they provide them with intelligence, they provide them with other logistic support to the drones and other counterterrorism efforts. And the third reason that we don't have a genuine discussion is because we don't know what's going on in the tribal areas. Tribal areas are still run by the same system and the same set of rules which were drafted by the British, and Pakistanis continue to rule them in the same way as the British did. So there is no access to the real people and to the real spot where the drone attacks take place. So what happened all these years that we, Pakistanis, they would put anti-drone stories in the media. That story would be what we call the circular reportage. The local media reports, New York Times take it, Washington Post, other media, and then it comes here to the US. The Americans are reading and they think that the drones are bad because they are killing civilians. no one knows what the situation on the ground is and then some studies were conducted here, especially the latest one by NYU and Stanford, which I was telling someone that someone asked me about how authentic it is. I said this is done by lawyers, and the lawyer's job is to prove themselves right. It's not necessarily that what's there on the ground, because you don't have access to the ground. So what happened with this study is that they go there and they have interviewed, I think, only 130 people, and only 60 of them are claimed to be direct victims. The rest are indirect, second and third hand accounts. So there is problem with the methodology, there is problem with the access, and there is problem with the overall understanding of what's going on in Pakistan, and especially how things are manipulated for political purposes by the government, by the military, and by the media, and also why the access is not granted to the human rights organization, to the foreign media, and to the places in FATA where the drone strikes are taking place. So if you talk to the people in FATA about the drones, they are very much in favor of the drones. And the reason is that they have seen the alternatives. 4 million people have been displaced since 2004. 1 million people are still in the camps in very bad conditions. They have, for more than 4 years, they have no idea when they will be going back to their houses. In most of the cases, their houses, I come from South Waziristan. South Waziristan is now a ghost town. It has been completely destroyed by Pakistani jet bombers and artillery. So you can't go back there. So if you talk to a local guy from Waziristan, he will say drones are good because drone only kill or destroy one room of my house, and it has never displaced a single family in all these 8-9 years of the operation. So I mean, the main problem with the drones, I think, is first of all, as everyone mentioned, there should be more transparency. And the transparency would come here in the US, and either it should be given from CIA to DOD, which people are now talking about because of all this pressure and the debate. And secondly, we have to bring transparency in our relationship between Pakistan and the US. We have to know what they have agreed. Like the Pakistani foreign ministry spokesman, in the US he said that we have sorted out everything with the Americans, now we are okay, the relationship is fine. But when the UN rapporteur, he went there, the foreign ministry said that it's against our sovereignty, we have not consented to the drone attacks, and they should be stopped. So what it does is it creates more confusion, and it also, and the problem really is, what's the alternative? Unless Pakistan comes up with an effective counter-terrorism strategy in dealing with the militants and the terrorist groups in the FATA, drones will be the only option available for the Americans to continue with. Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to stand up. We've got about 25 minutes. I thought I'd take a few to ask a couple of questions of my own, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So, four really terrific and provocative presentations from different perspectives. I wanted to zero in on a question that maybe David directly addressed to an extent, but others touched upon as well, which is essentially what should be done. And what, as a practical matter, if you were advising the Obama administration, would you lay out as concrete steps that could be taken in a second term to address precedent problem internationally that Gabor outlined, and to fulfill some of the objectives that you've all advocated for? And I want to make the question even more specific, which is, if I were the president and David, you were advising me about what I might do, and suppose I said that I'm reelected I'm reelected, I've got a great political machine, I'm willing to take some risks. Is jettisoning or radically narrowing the war paradigm described by AUMF a wise place to begin? Or, if I hear you correctly, would you advise not working so pointedly on the war paradigm and the AUMF scope, but instead addressing the use of imminence, transparency, accountability within decision-making, due process, all of which could be improved, if I'm hearing you correctly, without necessarily changing the scope of the AUMF?
I guess my answer would be yes. That is, I think that it's. I think there's a place for killing in an armed conflict. We are still engaged in an armed conflict in Afghanistan and the border regions of Pakistan. That is much more problematic when you get far removed from the battlefield. But that because this tool creates all the problems that I have suggested, it's absolutely critical that we be clear and public about the rules that we're employing and willing to defend them around the world. And that's the number one thing. I think and that would include questions about substance, of who can be targeted, and procedures of how one decides whether someone fits within that substantive definition. But I think one of the questions that you inevitably get to pretty quickly when you engage in this debate about targeted killing is, are we in a war paradigm or are we in a law enforcement paradigm? Because the power to kill in those two paradigms is very different. There's power to kill in both paradigms. Police officers can kill, and soldiers can kill, but there are very different rules that govern those two settings. And I repeat myself, but I think there's a tendency to treat a terrorist threat that has a Muslim flavor to it as a war threat, as an armed attack on the United States, justifying the use of lethal force. And I just don't. I think that's very problematic expansion of the concept of war.
And your China analogy, which is very compelling, and you could imagine that scenario unfolding and the targeted entity being something like Coll, which might be recognized by the United States as a legitimate exiled opposition, nonetheless be targeted in Los Angeles by the Chinese government on finding that they're engaged in revolutionary activity against the Chinese state. But when you play that scenario all the way out, it sort of leads you to think this is really about power, not about law. And so in the answer to the question, because if the Chinese acted in such a way, of course the United States would declare war against China long before the second strike was launched. So if it's about power at least as much as about law, if not more so, I know I'm asking some lawyers for an answer about the relevance of law, what then should the United States do to responsibly exercise the power that it does in fact possess to create a durable international system that is inclusive and rooted in concepts of human rights and law? I mean, Hina, do you want to take a pass to that or?
Well, I start from the premise that we have the law that we need. The law that we need exists. We've used it. We've applied it. We understand and agree that under our Constitution, outside of an armed conflict, lethal force can be used against specific concrete and imminent threats. The problem here is, how does the administration choose to define each one of those categories, and most primarily imminence? We have the law that we need in the context of an armed conflict, and I agree with David that that's really what the crucial question has come down to, right? How do we define now, 10 years after 9/11, where we are at war and who we are at war against? The political and policy imperative amongst some to continue perpetuating this war paradigm-based approach to the threat of terrorism is, I think, one of the most destabilizing factors that we currently face, both politically, policy-wise, and as a moral and ethical matter. And that is because, well, for a number of the reasons that David raised out, the ethical and moral ones, but also because we are, we're on a very delicate precipice. With the end of the war in Afghanistan, there will be an end to war-based authority. So there will be an end to the authority to use lethal force in Afghanistan or arguably lawfully in the border regions of Pakistan. And the idea that we now start at a time when our policymakers are telling us that core al-Qaeda has been decimated, to create war authority or to advance it in other parts of the world is, I think, a very, very dangerous one. We can all recognize that the threat of terrorism may be a global problem, but a war-based response to that threat now, I think, endangers us more than it makes us safer. And I think, let me give you just a couple of examples on the precedent point. The precedent that this administration is setting is one that is set not just for other countries, but for the president that comes after and the president that comes after that. Because executive power, once claimed, is very, very hard to rein back in. And we're facing a situation now where, for political reasons, you have a Democratic administration, Democratic Congress that wants to be, for understandable reasons, strong on national security. And so what you have is a threat of a bipartisan consensus coalescing around the authority that the administration is claiming now. If we don't bring that back in within this administration, not by legitimizing it, not by legitimizing the authority that is being claimed, but by really reining it back in, then we face the possibility that it will be used again by the next administration, the one to come after that. Russia, in 2009, passed its anti-terrorism law that allowed the president to use lethal force unilaterally outside of the territory of Russia. Russia might do that, you might say. But Russian lawmakers at the time said, we're doing what the United States claims the authority to do. And so the precedent that we're setting now is going to be used by other countries. China, a couple of weeks ago, claimed the authority, or there was a news report that it wanted to use drones in Burma, in Myanmar, against a drug lord. Now, it turns out they may not have that weaponry, they may not have the capability to do that, but it is really a matter of time where if we don't rein our authority in, others will claim it, and we will not be on solid legal, political, or policy grounds to protest.
Warren, you want to
Yes, Steve, you mentioned the issue of ending the war paradigm, David and others as well. And I think what's helpful as a what do we do next idea is thinking about ending the war paradigm not as the next advocacy step, but rather as a desired end state. I don't think there's much utility to whatever the form it takes, whether it's standing in front of the White House with a sign or going to Congress and say, end the war paradigm. I think rather what helps is to break that down into its component parts. And as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, it's the problem of the standoff concerning the use of the criminal justice system in the first place. It's the restrictions that Congress has placed on the ability of the president to close Guantanamo, the restrictions that are placed on the use of Article III courts and traditional prosecutions in federal courts, and it's the continued use of military commissions that Congress has authorized through the Military Commissions Act. And to various extents, the administration has either endorsed or mildly opposed but failed to do anything other than state its opposition to these restrictions. They're continuing to I wouldn't say happily, but continuing to use military commission prosecutions in Guantanamo. They're a disaster by any measure, but as long as they continue, it will not create the kind of pressure that's necessary to reopen our Article 3 courts for the vast majority of these types of cases. And the same thing with the mere existence of Guantanamo. Complaints persist that, well, the president should be sending people to Guantanamo. As long as Guantanamo exists, as long as military commissions exist, and as long as there continue to be restrictions placed on the president on bringing people into the United States and subjecting them to traditional prosecution in our federal courts, it'll be very difficult to end the war paradigm. But if the administration does what it needs to do, and what I think it can do to push back against these institutions that have been created over the course of the last decade, then I think that will give us the end stage desired result of ending the war paradigm.
Thank you. My last question for Zubair. You made provocative remarks in which you said, on the one hand, that it was very, if I heard you correctly, that it was very difficult to accurately document public opinion in the federally administered tribal areas, particularly in the South and North Waziristan, where the drone attacks seem have been heaviest. And then at the same time, you said your intuition, as someone who comes from South Waziristan, is that in fact the drones are not so unpopular, and in fact are respected in some sections of the public opinion. I guess the question I wanted to ask is, there's a debate that has surfaced a few times this morning about whether or not drones, because of their unmanned character, the way they hover over targets, the sort of sense of omniscience, an eye in the sky, almost from a science fiction film, whether they really are a different sort of military technology, create a different effect in the target population than F-16s or units of the Pakistani infantry lobbing artillery over a bridge. What is your sense, as someone who travels to South Waziristan, of the peculiar characteristics of drone attacks on the psychology of the public?
I mean, drone attacks, it has affected mostly the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. It has affected their social behavior. It has affected their social pattern of life, and they don't gather in large numbers. They don't eat together as they used to. They don't sleep together in places. So one guy, for example, he would tell me that they sleep in trees. We can't sleep in trees the whole of our lives. So they come out, and you have seen one thing. After this NYU study, I called a local guy in North Waziristan, and he had hosted me back in 2007. So I thought I should just check with him how is he doing. I had not knocked. So first I asked him how is life. He said life is very bad because there are curfews going on every second day because of the Pakistani security forces organized movement. Then he complained about a possible operation in North Waziristan because there was news that Pakistanis eventually might go in there. And third, he was talking about his business. The last thing, then I asked him, what about the drones? And he said, what do you mean? I said, you don't care about the drones, you are not afraid? He said, you know me, I'm not a Talib, I'm not Al-Qaeda. Why should I care about the drones? So the drones, they are remote, they can be heard only, and as I said, they are intelligence based, and there are news, like New York Times has a story that it is creating some sort of tribal rivalries, tribal distrust among population. But I think it's not among people, it's within the Taliban. Because if you are related with Taliban in one capacity or another, if you are their driver, if you are a courier, you will be killed in a drone attack. Or the Taliban will arrest you on suspicion of being a spy. And it happened, like, look at, for example, this Jordanian bomber who attacked the CIA camp enforced. He was a double agent. So he was refused by Al-Qaeda to be with them, but the Pakistani Taliban took it. So I mean, tribal people are traumatized. There is no doubt in it. But they are more traumatized because of other factors than the drones. Drones, they think, is the lesser of the necessary evil. There has to be something to take care of the Taliban. And then the traditional structure has been collapsed in the tribal areas. So there is the people who would stand up to the Taliban, they cannot stand up to them. Because in some cases they think that this Talib is a good Talib, he is being supported by the Pakistanis for their efforts, for their games in Afghanistan. So the drones, they give them this deniability. They are happy that someone is killed, but they are not involved. So that's why they like drones in that perspective, because the alternatives are bad and there is no other option for them.
Thank you. We've got time for 4 or 5 questions, I imagine. This gentleman here.
Thank you so much. This question kind of bridges the gap between this panel and the next panel. So the other panelists, if they want to answer it, that's fine as well. With this, one of the problems that I see is accountability. Who is held accountable as far as for abuse of power? Is the president, I mean, if 4,000 people are killed, does it become a war crimes issue? And then does, the court in The Hague go ahead and take it? So where do you see the accountability and who is accountable? Where would you like to see that accountability, one, idealistically, but then what would be feasibly, politically feasibly possible as far as how would accountability be held for abuse of power?
Great, that's a good question. So let me ask first David and Gabor, or Hina, if any of you knows whether there is an established procedure in the Obama administration to address errors outside of hot battlefields in drone strikes.
I don't know that there's one. I was in conversation with somebody who claimed that they always follow up drone strikes to determine whether there have been innocent civilians killed and report on that and offer compensation to the victims. I don't, but I have no, they never said that publicly. If they do that, I mean, this is part of the problem. If they did that, and they did it in a public way, it would probably reduce resentment. But because the quid pro quo of getting these countries to agree to allow us to kill their citizens is that we do it in an unacknowledged way, we can't even do that in a public way. So
internationally, Gabor, if the Obama administration doesn't make transparent the kinds of processes that might or might not be there, what are the plausible pathways in the European legal system or elsewhere in the international legal system to force accountability from the outside?
Well, under the, you mentioned European, there is a European Convention on Human Rights, and unlike the International Human Rights Convention that applies to the United States, for which there is no enforceability mechanism, the European Convention does have an enforceability mechanism. It's the European Court of Human Rights. And if you are a European aggrieved by a U.S. policy, you would still have to draw some connection to some European states' obligations under that convention, as was the case in al-Masri, which was an individual who was detained for the CIA, but with the concurrence of Macedonia. So the opportunities to use an existing judicial, say, European mechanism are pretty slim. The opportunities to use an American judicial mechanism are even slimmer, as the ACLU has experienced.
ACLU, you can say something.
Yes. You're on a field watch in Alice in Wonderland now.
We're actually not. So we've We filed a lawsuit seeking accountability for the killings of the 3 U.S. citizens in Yemen in 2011, and the government takes the position that these are political questions in which the court should not get involved, that there are special factors that preclude judicial review, and that the individuals who authorized and directed the killings of the citizens have immunity for the actions that they took in their official capacity. And this is a bigger problem in terms of accountability for human rights violations post 9/11, which is the difficult legal environment and the government's largely successful invocation of immunity and jurisdictional doctrines. This case is fully briefed. We're waiting for the court to set an oral argument, and we'll see where that goes. That will take place over the course of this year. But I think your question raises a broader point, and that is one that I sort of started out with, which is with the level of secrecy, there can be little meaningful accountability, either legally or politically or with respect to the public, and that's part of where we are now. I think that there are people in the next panel who would probably know a lot more about this than I do, but during the Brennan nomination hearings, he said that there are, in fact, after-action reports for all of these targeted killings, and I think one of the important things to ask for is information about these reports, not sources and methods, and I just rule that there's no need for disclosure of that information, but if you've got these after-action reports, what legitimacy is there to not releasing information about who has been killed, why, whether they were a militant, whether they were a civilian, and then providing compensation, yes, compensation to people who have been wrongfully harmed. We do that in Afghanistan, we did that in Iraq, and we did that in the context of traditional wars, in the context of, even if you accept, and I don't, that this is an armed conflict situation in Yemen and other places, but surely if you're engaged in these untraditional activities and if you want to avoid blowback, then you should at least acknowledge and compensate for mistakes that will inevitably be made.
Karen, may I have permission to extend for comments? Thank you. Dan. Sorry, no, it's Dan Clyburn behind you, sir, if you don't mind, then I'll sit down. You had a chance to ask in the last session. I'm just trying to spread it around.
There have been suggestions in the press, and I think John Brennan has actually said this publicly, that ultimately the administration would want to shift the drone program or targeted killing programs away from the CIA to the military. Let the CIA do its traditional business of collecting and analyzing intelligence, and the military do what it's done traditionally, which is lethal operations. Is that a step in the right direction in terms of more transparency and accountability? Let me ask you, Hina, would that assuage some, many, any of your concerns about the way the program has been run? Is that something that you would be in favor of?
I certainly think that getting the CIA out of the paramilitary killing business would be a good thing. And I think that it would enhance both the ability to review the lawfulness of these strikes, the wisdom, effectiveness, if we are not engaged in covert actions. I would be concerned if we hand these strikes over to JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, because I think the level of secrecy that surrounds its operations is too high. We know from doctrine that the Air Force issues and the other parts of the military issue what criteria they use in Afghanistan. Certainly, I think it would be better as a first step to get the CIA out of this business, and if we're going to engage in these programs, to do it through the military, and I would say also doing it under the accepted by the international community criteria under the rules of war and human rights.
So I think there's time for one more. Yes, sir.
I believe the panel has quite intelligently expressed their viewpoints from their perspective. But from the viewpoint of a person in the street, I'm just wondering, a few questions come to mind. First of
Maybe
all,
just one or two.
okay. First of all, the question was raised several times. The point was raised. What are we doing in certain places? Is this a threat to the United States? But it doesn't have to be a threat to the United States. It can be a threat to an ally under a treaty. And this threat, does it come within the parameters of what we understand to be war? Like, do we have to declare war against them, or are they declaring war against us? Because if they're declaring war against us, I certainly expect my government to do whatever they have to do to protect me and my fellow citizens. My other question is, if they are establishing, if they are using drones, my understanding is that drones are not done in a vacuum, that they're based on intelligence that comes from on the ground, and as one of the panelists just noted, even afterwards, there's an investigation to see what kind of damage and whether or not there was a validity to what was done. So all of these various factors come into play when one tries to consider what is armed conflict. Are the Geneva Courts still applicable in the days of asymmetrical warfare?
Right, so that's a good question, and in fact, it was a question that was asked of Mr. Johnson in his speech, and he essentially punted it, if I heard him correctly, by saying, I don't know what the threat stream is, so I can't tell you whether we should be at war today and with whom. And that seemed a kind of elastic basis for American war policy over the next 20 or 30 years. What should be the criteria, any of you, for judging firmly and at what interval in this asymmetric environment, which groups, which associated groups are genuinely at war with the United States or we with them? How do we do that?
Well, maybe if we usurp the entire next session.
Yeah. All right, we'll say 30 seconds, and then we'll leave it to them.
The best way I can approach this very kind of broad and diffuse question is with reference to the more specific question, I think, of whether or not the existing legal frameworks that we have are or are not adequate to the so-called the new threats that we face. And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. There always have been, there always will be uncertainties along the margins, but we have long had a system of international law that defines armed conflict in accordance with recognizable armed groups with command structures through whom the rights and responsibilities of the laws of war can be implemented. And if it's so diffuse that you don't have a command structure, then you don't have an armed conflict. You also need a threshold of severity and frequency of hostilities in order to apply the laws of armed conflict. If you don't have that, it ain't war. It doesn't matter whether somebody declares war against you or not. What matters is what they are and what they do on the ground. And the existing structures that we've had in place ever since the Geneva Conventions were most recently promulgated in their present form, 1949, and the laws on the conduct of hostilities, which, by the way, are not part of the Geneva Conventions, are still applicable and are still good for these purposes.
That's excellent. David, you want the last word?
Just to say, just a cautionary note. I mean, I think that part of the drone policy is premised on this notion that we can kill our way out of this problem. If we kill enough people, the problem will go away. And a couple of weeks ago, I saw the documentary "The Gatekeepers," which is about Israel's problems with terrorism. They've had a much longer and much more serious problem with terrorist threats, and it was interviews with the leaders of Shin Bet, the security services for Israel. And the story that they told was one of deep skepticism about the wisdom of such a strategy, which they had employed. And they showed one targeted killing after another being responded to by yet another terrorist attack. And I think we're seeing that in the kind of blowback effects that are being reported out of Yemen and Pakistan. Yes, we're killing some people, but they're just building more and more. And so that, I think, whatever the legal question ought to be, there's a strategic question. And I come back to Dennis Blair's point, which is that even if it's legal, if it's doing more harm than good, if it's creating more terrorists than it is eliminating, it's not a solution to the problem.
Great. Please join me in thanking the panel for their time.